Have you ever stopped to think that some things seem to happen with eerie perfection, as if someone had written the script before the events even happened? Well, today, I'm going to tell you the strangest story of my career as an investigator. But first, tell me, have you subscribed to the channel yet? If not, do it now, like it, and comment below what you would do in my place. Because after what I'm about to reveal, you'll want to share your opinion. It all started with something seemingly banal. A suitcase forgotten in the back seat of a taxi. But what was inside? Well, it could change the course of history. Photographs, classified documents, detailed maps, and even records of crimes that hadn't even happened yet. Yes, you heard right. They were evidence of future crimes. When I opened that briefcase, I felt like I was holding the future in my hands. A dark, cruel, and meticulously planned future. With each page I read, it was as if a curtain was being pulled back, revealing secrets no one should know. And believe me, discovering that was like walking through a door that could never be closed again. And the craziest part, this story isn't about coincidences. It's about power, conspiracy, and manipulation on a level you never imagined. So stick with me until the end, because what started with a simple briefcase ended up becoming the most disturbing and personal investigation of my life. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was a cold, rainy night, the kind when even the city seems to want to hide. I was driving home when I received a call from an old friend, a taxi driver with a voice as shaky as I'd ever heard. He said he'd found something strange in the back seat of the car, something that he said could change everything. I confess that at that moment my curiosity got the better of me than common sense. When I arrived, I saw the briefcase, black, discreet, but carrying a heavy aura, as if it were hiding a dark secret. The taxi driver could barely explain what he'd seen inside, only repeating that it wasn't good. I opened the briefcase carefully, feeling that shiver run down my spine that only experienced investigators know well. And oh, what I saw inside took my breath away. There were photographs, maps, documents, but these weren't ordinary papers. Each page seemed to have been written for someone specific, as if it were a predefined script for a crime that hadn't even happened yet. I remember looking at my friend and noticing that he was pale, perhaps realizing that somehow he was already involved in something bigger than the two of us. Then and there, I knew that night would only be the beginning. Holding that briefcase, I felt the weight of responsibility in my hands. It wasn't just a clue. It was practically a warning, a harbinger of tragedy. And the question that consumed me was, who the hell would have access to this kind of information before the crimes even occurred? I needed to act fast, because deep down, something told me that time was against us. And that wouldn't be the only surprise of this investigation. As I examined every detail of the briefcase, I realized nothing was there by chance. The photos showed ordinary people, but with a strangely similar expression: fear. Beside each image were dates, times, and locations, as if someone had compiled a macabre agenda. And believe me, it all seemed so well planned that it was impossible not to feel we were dealing with something much bigger than a simple crime. I picked up one of the maps and saw that several points were marked in red, forming a sort of route. This route crossed different neighborhoods, some of them known for their history of unsolved, mysterious cases. I felt a chill run down my spine when I realized the first address was just a few hours away. If I wanted to prevent tragedy, I would have to act immediately. It was impossible to ignore that the briefcase seemed designed to fall into my hands. It was as if someone knew that I, John Spencer, would eventually enter this dangerous game, and this made me suspicious. Was it a coincidence, or was someone using me as a piece in a much larger game? I'd seen this kind of manipulation before, and believe me, it always ended badly for those who let themselves be taken in. That's when I noticed something even more disturbing. Along with the papers, there was a flash drive. I plugged it into the laptop I carry with me on every investigation. And to my surprise, there were videos recorded in places that could only have been filmed with restricted access, as if someone had been infiltrated, or worse, someone with access to information that not even the authorities had. And that was just the beginning of an even darker web of clues. After a few hours of analysis, I knew I needed to find out who had left that suitcase in the taxi. I asked my friend to show me the footage from the security camera installed in the car. And there he was, a man in a dark suit, with a restless look in his eyes, his hands trembling, as if carrying the weight of an unbearable secret. It was impossible not to notice the fear etched on his face. The strangest thing was that, when he got out of the taxi, he simply vanished. No street cameras recorded where he went, as if he'd vanished into thin air. I'd seen people disappear mysteriously before, but this felt different. It was as if someone had deliberately covered all their tracks. I began to pull the threads of the investigation. License plates of nearby cars, bank transactions, phone records. Nothing. The man seemed to never have existed. And believe me, when an investigator like me encounters too much silence, it's because someone powerful is ensuring that silence exists. And this only increased my certainty that there was much more at play. But then, amidst all this emptiness, an intriguing detail emerged. In the briefcase pocket was a small card with a strange symbol, something I'd seen before in an old case. A case I'd never been able to solve. It was at that moment that I realized that mysterious man and I might be connected in a way I didn't yet understand. As I reviewed each document in the briefcase, something began to catch my eye. Some names and places were all too familiar. It was like being punched in the gut when I realized that many of those addresses were linked to old cases I'd investigated myself, but, for some reason, never managed to solve. It was as if someone was rubbing my career failures in my face. Each document seemed to mock me, showing me that the crimes of years ago might never have been the work of chance. There were subtle patterns I'd never noticed before, patterns that now made perfect sense. That moment made me think about how often we stare at the evidence without seeing what's really right in front of us. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden. It's just disguised as normality. I remembered an old investigation, a serial disappearance case that had brought the city to a standstill. At the time, all the clues pointed to a common killer, but something never convinced me. Now, seeing those connections in the briefcase, I realized that perhaps it had all been part of a larger plan, far more sophisticated than we'd imagined. And what frightened me most was realizing that some victims still had living relatives who could be in danger. That completely changed my perspective. I wasn't just faced with a new case, but with the potential key to unlocking decades of unsolved mysteries. And deep down, I knew the next revelation would be even more disturbing. Among the papers scattered on the table, I noticed some stamps that chilled my blood. They were symbols of national security agencies, documents that should never be outside of classified files. Just touching those sheets made me feel like I was treading on forbidden ground. This wasn't just a potential crime. It was a direct breach of information that could bring down entire governments. As I leafed through the files, I noticed that many reports contained details that even high-ranking investigators don't usually access. It was as if someone had a free pass to the darkest secrets of power. And believe me, I've seen plenty of people disappear for much less than that. This feeling of meddling with something untouchable made my heart beat faster. I wondered how it would be possible for an ordinary person to have access to such protected information. The answer was obvious. The briefcase owner wasn't just trying to prevent crimes. He was involved in something much more dangerous, perhaps even part of an inside scheme. And that would explain why he seemed to be running from something or someone who knew exactly what he was carrying. But the most terrifying piece was yet to come. A report describing future crimes, signed with initials that appeared to belong to high-ranking government officials. If true, we were faced with a conspiracy with ramifications far beyond what I had imagined. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. Among the objects in the briefcase, there was something that truly intrigued me. A small, unmarked, metallic device, the size of a cell phone. When I turned it on, it projected real-time data about people, locations, and even private conversations onto my computer screen. It was as if someone had unrestricted access to any information they wanted. This was far beyond any technology I'd ever seen in official investigations. I tested some features and realized the device could track movements in seconds, cross-referencing data from street cameras, cell phones, and even encrypted app messages. This wasn't just illegal. It was impossible for any ordinary person Only someone with immense resources and powerful connections could have access to something like this. The realization dawned on me that the technology didn't seem current, but too advanced. It was as if it had come from a future that hadn't yet arrived. The accuracy of the data, the way the information updated itself, everything indicated that this wasn't something made for ordinary hands to use. It was a tool for those who wanted to always be 10 steps ahead. And it was at that moment that I felt a chill run down my spine. If someone had all this at their fingertips, controlling crimes and even predicting their victims' every move would be too easy. But the question that gnawed at me was, who else knew about the device's existence? And how far could this network of power reach? It was when I opened a red folder inside the briefcase that the story took an even more disturbing turn. There was a list of names, and they weren't ordinary ones. Influential politicians, billionaire businessmen, journalists I already knew were rubbing shoulders with powerful people, and even some celebrities whose deaths would shock the entire world. Each name was accompanied by a detailed fate, as if the crimes were already scripted. As I read, I felt like I was peering behind the scenes of a macabre play, in which each victim played a crucial role in something much larger. Some of these names were directly linked to investigations I'd conducted in the past, and this made me realize that somehow I was at the center of this story before I even knew it. I remembered an old interview with one of these journalists, in which he jokingly told me that some truths are too dangerous to reveal. Now, seeing his name on that list, I understood that it wasn't a joke at all. It was a countdown to silence voices that were too disturbing. Worst of all, some of the planned crimes seemed destined to provoke large-scale chaos. Economic crises, violent protest, political instability. The briefcase didn't just speak of death. It spoke of power, manipulation, and control. And deep down, I knew the next clue would reveal how far this network of influence could go. As I organized the documents on my desk, I noticed that some diagrams connected names, events, and locations around the world. It was like looking at a giant spider's web, each thread connecting one tragedy to another. The lines passed through major financial centers, powerful government headquarters, and even seemingly philanthropic organizations. It was impossible not to feel that all of it had a calculated purpose. There were reports describing how certain international crises were actually staged to divert attention from larger crimes happening behind the scenes. It reminded me of past cases where I felt something was off, but could never prove anything. Now, those reports showed me that the entire world could be rigged like a chess game. The most frightening thing was realizing that some of the connections involved rival countries secretly working together. This broke with any official narrative we usually hear in the news. It was like discovering that behind the scenes, declared enemies were actually playing the same side to keep the masses under control. And in that instant, it dawned on me, the briefcase wasn't just about isolated crimes, but about a global project to shape the future, according to the interests of a few. I knew that from then on, each clue revealed would put me even further on the radar of those who didn't want this truth to come to light. At the bottom of the briefcase, I found a small, black-covered notebook with strange symbols and seemingly random numbers. At first glance, it looked like meaningless scribblings, but with my experience, I realized it was a code. I spent hours trying to decipher it, using techniques I'd learned from old espionage cases. Gradually, the messages began to make sense, and what they said was chilling. The notes mentioned deadlines, exact times, and short phrases like "the next one will be the signal," and "they can't know yet." It was as if the criminals were communicating using a secret language to avoid being traced. I've dealt with encrypted messages before, but I've never seen anything so sophisticated and yet so disturbing in its simplicity. One of the passages mentioned a zero event, something that seemed to be the trigger for all the other planned crimes. And the more I read, the more it felt like I was racing against time, because the countdown had already begun. Just thinking that every second lost could cost lives, I felt the weight of that investigation grow even heavier on my shoulders. And then at the end of the notebook, I found one last sentence that made me freeze. "He is already among us." There was no explanation, no context, just that ominous sentence, as if it were a direct warning to me. It was impossible not to imagine that everything was about to get worse. I was sitting in my living room, surrounded by all those documents, when the phone rang. On the other end, a nervous voice was warning about a brutal crime that had just occurred in the city. The detail: the victim was the very first name on the list in the briefcase. My heart raced. Everything I feared was beginning to come true. I rushed to the crime scene, and upon arriving realized that every detail had happened exactly as described in the documents. The location, the time, even the way the victim was found. This couldn't be a coincidence. I felt as if someone had scripted the crime with surgical precision, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was dealing with something completely beyond my control. As I surveyed the scene, I noticed something even stranger. Cameras were positioned at strategic points, as if someone had a front row seat to the scene. Who would do this? Why? This question echoed in my mind, as I realized I wasn't just an investigator trying to solve a case. I was becoming part of it. As I left, I glanced at my watch and realized the next name on the list had only a few hours before suffering the same fate. The countdown was on, and the sense of urgency consumed me like never before. If I wanted to save anyone, I would have to race against an enemy who seemed to always know my every move. The next morning, I received a frantic call from my taxi driver friend. He said he'd noticed a black car following him everywhere since the previous night. His voice was shaky, filled with fear. That's when I realized he'd unwittingly become part of this deadly game just by finding the briefcase. Whoever was behind it all knew exactly who we were. I ran to his house, and on the way noticed two suspicious vehicles circling the area. When I arrived, I found his taxi with broken windows and clear signs of a break-in. My friend was hiding, terrified, saying he'd seen masked men trying to break into his house earlier. That confirmed my suspicions. Now we weren't just hunters, we were the prey. To protect him, I took him to a safe location, far from the city. But even there, I felt like our every move was being monitored. I'd been in dangerous situations before, but I'd never felt this sense of being hunted at every move. Whoever was behind this operation would stop at nothing to silence anyone who got too close to the truth. It was at that moment that I realized that keeping the suitcase with us was a huge risk, but handing it over to the authorities could be even worse, since I didn't know who to trust. This doubt began to gnaw at my thoughts, and deep down, I knew the worst was yet to come. When I decided to share some of the information with a trusted contact within the police force, I noticed something strange. He seemed overly interested in details I hadn't yet revealed, asking questions that made no sense to someone who was supposed to be just helping. My instinct screamed, something was wrong with this man. I continued to feign normalcy, but I began to observe his movements. And to my surprise, I discovered he was passing information to someone on the outside. This made me furious, and at the same time sick to my stomach. I'd seen double agents before, but never so close to me. It was like being betrayed by someone you swore you knew. I decided to test it. I gave false information about the briefcase's location and lay in wait. Sure enough, within hours, armed men appeared at the exact location I'd mentioned. The confirmation came as a punch in the chest. I was dealing with a network infiltrated within the authorities themselves, and the danger was now even greater than I'd imagined. From that moment on, I realized I couldn't trust anyone, not even those who claimed to be on my side. Every step would have to be calculated, every word chosen carefully. And as I digested this betrayal, a new clue emerged, something that would completely change the way I viewed the case. Among the most hidden documents in the briefcase was a folder embossed with an enigmatic symbol. Opening it, I found reports and lists of members of an organization that seemed to have been operating in the shadows for decades, perhaps centuries. They called themselves the Order of the Eclipse, and, judging by the writing, they held influence over governments, companies, and even military forces around the world. The reports described how they manipulated historical events to shape society according to their own interests. It was disturbing to see how some events I had always considered coincidental had actually been meticulously planned. Here was proof that nothing was random, and that real power never rested in the hands of those we see on television. Even more frightening was the realization that this organization seemed to have arms in several areas: technology, economics, politics, security, and even entertainment. Everything was connected, as if each citizen's life were just a piece on a vast board. They didn't just predict crimes, they created them, shaping the world through chaos. And then I realized the owner of the briefcase was probably part of this order, but had decided to betray his own comrades. Perhaps he was repentant, perhaps someone who saw something too great to bear. Either way, I knew that from that moment on, I was picking a fight with the most dangerous people on Earth. After cross-referencing information from cameras, bank records, and even coded messages, I finally found a solid lead on the briefcase's owner. His name was Adrian Keller, a former international security analyst who disappeared years ago after leaking classified documents about covert military operations. Many thought he was dead, but something told me he was very much alive and closer than I thought. Keller was known for his brilliance and danger. According to old files, he had access to secrets that could bring down entire governments. But what intrigued me was why he would have left the briefcase behind. Was it carelessness, or was it all part of a much larger plan? My experience told me that nothing about it was a coincidence. I found an old message on an underground dark web forum, signed with Keller's initials. The message read, "If you're reading this, you already know you can't trust anyone. The truth is more lethal than any weapon." It almost sounded like a confession, or perhaps a direct warning to anyone about to follow his lead. At that moment, I realized that perhaps Keller had chosen me. Perhaps I was just another pawn in his game to bring down the organization from within. But if that was the case, then where was he now? And why did he always seem to be one step ahead of me? As I reviewed the documents again, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Several dates in the files hadn't yet occurred. These weren't vague predictions, they were events described in detail. Names, locations, exact times. It was as if someone had traveled back in time or had access to information from a future already written. The more I analyzed, the stranger it became. The crimes listed seemed surgically interconnected to generate political and economic impacts across the globe. It was impossible to believe that all of this was the result of mere human planning. At times I felt as if I were witnessing something beyond common comprehension. I kept thinking about how often we underestimate the forces that move the world. Perhaps the real question wasn't who controls everything, but when that control begins. It felt like we were playing a game whose rules had already been decided long before we stepped onto the field. And then a question began to consume me. Was Adrian Keller trying to prevent an inevitable future, or ensure it would unfold exactly as planned? This question grew more pressing with each new clue I uncovered. As I cross-referenced the data in the briefcase with old files from secret investigations, I realized that many of the names involved in the crimes held very high positions. There were ministers, generals, business leaders, and even renowned judges. It was as if the entire power structure was tainted, ensuring that no one could ever expose the truth. I recalled past cases where evidence had mysteriously disappeared, witnesses had disappeared, and cases had been dismissed without explanation. Now, it all made sense. These people weren't working in isolation, but in concert, protecting each other. It was a web of corruption so deep that any attempt to confront it seemed futile. The more I read, the clearer it became that the organization not only committed crimes but also crafted laws, manipulated elections, and bought silence. It was frightening to think how most people live believing in a democracy that, at its core, is just a play. It made me reflect on how dangerous truth is when it threatens enormous interests. And that's when I realized if I tried to expose this alone, I probably wouldn't live to tell the tale. I'd need allies. But in such a tainted world, how could I trust someone without being betrayed along the way? I decided to form a small team with people I believed were trustworthy, old partners from past investigations. However, over time, I noticed that some of them were acting strangely. Unanswered messages, sudden disappearances, and suspicious questions began to make me uneasy. The feeling of being monitored had never been so strong. One night, while we were reviewing the documents, I noticed one of my partners exchange a quick glance with another team member. It seemed like a simple gesture, but my investigator's instincts alerted me. Something was wrong. That's when I began dropping false clues, testing each other's loyalty. Didn't take long for the truth to come out. I discovered that two of them were passing information directly to members of the secret organization. The betrayal hurt more than any threat, because these were people who had once risked their lives alongside me. Seeing that even they had a price was a shock. I'll never forget. From that moment on, I understood that I was completely alone. If even my closest allies were purchasable, then any misstep could be my last. And yet, I knew the revelations that followed would be even more dangerous and shocking. It was when I found one last hidden file in the briefcase device that I realized the true scale of the threat. It was a kind of timeline with exact dates for each crime, all interconnected like dominoes. The last one would happen in just 72 hours, and the impact would be global, changing the course of history forever. Every detail was accurately described. Explosions, strategic assassinations, and financial manipulations capable of bringing down entire markets. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating, as if I were trying to stop an avalanche with my bare hands. For the first time, I questioned whether there was still time to save anyone. I began to cross-reference each point of the plan with the remaining clues, trying to find flaws, loopholes that could delay or at least prevent part of the tragedy. But the more I analyzed, the more I realized that everything was meticulously planned. It was as if, no matter what I did, the outcome was already decided. Still, I knew I couldn't stop. This was the moment when any wrong decision would cost lives. And as I prepared my next move, an even more shocking discovery was about to change everything once and for all. When I finally managed to track down the origin of the encrypted messages and files, I found something that left me completely astonished. All roads led to a single name, Adrian Keller, but the truth was even more disturbing. He wasn't trying to stop the conspiracy. He was the true architect behind it all. The evidence showed that Keller had planned every detail, including the delivery of the briefcase to me. I wasn't the hero of the story, but just another carefully positioned piece in his game. The feeling of having been manipulated from the beginning made me tremble with anger and frustration. Reviewing each step I took, I realized he was always 10 steps ahead, anticipating my choices and even my reactions. It was as if I'd been trained to do exactly what he wanted. This realization was devastating, because it meant I might be helping to bring his plan to fruition without even realizing it. It was then that I wondered, what if this whole investigation was just a grand setup to turn me into an unwitting messenger? Maybe I'd never been in control of anything, but there was still one last clue. Something that promised to completely redefine everything I thought I knew up until that point. The next morning, I received an anonymous message with just one sentence. "You did exactly what we needed." The message included the location of an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Even though I knew it was a trap, I went there. In the center of the warehouse, on a rusty table, sat another suitcase identical to the first. When I opened it, I realized it was empty except for a single envelope. Inside was a list of new names, and to my shock, the first name on the list was mine. I felt a chill run through me. Everything indicated that from that moment on, I was no longer just an investigator. I had become the next piece to be eliminated. I looked around and realized there were hidden cameras everywhere. Whoever was behind it all knew exactly where I was, and was probably already ready for their next move. It felt like being trapped in an endless game, with no beginning or end. I left knowing this story wouldn't end anytime soon. The briefcase, the crimes, Keller. It was all just part of something much bigger. And deep down, I understood this wouldn't be the last we'd hear of this conspiracy. On the contrary, it was just the beginning. After all this, an inevitable question remains. What if there were someone behind every important event that happens in the world? Is life really made of coincidences, or are we all following a script we never truly understand? Perhaps the greatest lesson from this story is that the truth is always scarier and closer than we imagine. Now, I want to hear from you. If you found a briefcase like this, full of evidence of future crimes, what would you do? Would you try to stop what was about to happen, or would you stay away to avoid getting involved? Tell me in the comments, because I read each one and I really want to know your thoughts on this. And most importantly, What will you do with the clues life is already giving you? How often do you ignore obvious signs because you think you still have time? Perhaps today is the time to act, to make decisions that will change your future before someone else decides for you. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and like it, because what I have to share here goes far beyond investigative stories. They are lessons that can transform the way you see the world. And believe me, the next revelations will be even more impactful.